Chapter 6. How Saint Monica lived in the days of her widowhood, and how she put all her trust in God. Patricius had not much in the way of worldly goods to leave to his wife. She needed little, it is true, for herself, but there was Augustine. Would it be possible for her, even if she practiced the strictest economy, to keep him at Carthage, where he was doing so well? Romanianus divined her anxiety, and hastened to set it at rest. He had a house in Carthage, he said. It should be Augustine's as long as he required it. This would settle the question of lodging. For the rest, continued Romanianus, as an old friend of Patricius, he had the right to befriend his son, and Monica must grant him the privilege of acting a father's part to Augustine until he was fairly launched in life. He had a child of his own, a young son called Licentius. If Monica would befriend his boy, they would be quits. The gratitude of both mother and son towards this generous friend and benefactor lasted throughout their lives. Licentius was to feel its effects more than once. You it was, Romanianus, wrote Augustine in his Confessions, who, when I was a poor young student in Carthage, opened to me your house, your purse, and still more your heart. You it was who, when I had the sorrow to lose my father, comforted me by your friendship, helped me with your advice, and assisted me with your fortune. Monica mourned her husband's death with true devotion. But hers was not a selfish sorrow. She had love and sympathy for all who needed them, and forgot her own grief in solacing that of others. There were certain good works which the Church gave to Christian widows to perform. The hospitals, for instance, were entirely in their hands. They were small as yet, built according to the needs of the moment from the funds of the faithful, and held but few patients. These devoted women succeeded each other at intervals in their task of washing and attending to the sick, watching by their beds and cleaning their rooms. Their ministrations did not even cease there. With reverent care they prepared the dead for burial, thinking the while of the preparation of Christ's body for the tomb, and of him who said, "Inasmuch as ye do it to the least of my brethren, ye do it unto me." It was a happy moment for Monica when her turn came to serve the sick. She would kiss their sores for very pity as she washed and dressed them, and their faces grew bright at her coming. They called her Mother. It seemed such a natural name to give her, for she was a mother to them all, and gave them a mother's love. To some of the poor creatures, friendless slaves as they often were, who had known little sympathy or tenderness in their hard lives, it was a revelation of Christianity which taught them more than hours of preaching could have done. But there was other work besides that at the hospital. There were the poor to be helped, the hungry to be fed, the naked to be clothed. She would gather the orphan children at her knee to teach them the truths of their faith. When they were very poor, she would keep them in her own house, feed them at her own table, and clothe them with her own hands. "If I am a mother to these motherless ones," she would say to herself, "He will have mercy and give me back my boy. If I teach them to know and love him as a father, he will watch over my son." It was a custom of the time on the feasts of saints and martyrs to make a pilgrimage to their tombs, with a little basket of food and wine. This was laid on the grave, after which the faithful would partake of what they had brought, while they thought and spoke of the noble lives of God's servants who had gone before. The custom was abolished not long after, on account of the abuses which had arisen. But Monica observed it to the end. She scarcely tasted of her offering herself, but gave it all away to the poor. Often, indeed, she went cold and hungry, that they might be clothed and fed. Her love of prayer, too, could now find full scope. Every morning found her in her place in church for the holy sacrifice. Every evening she was there again, silent, absorbed in God. The place where she knelt was often wet with her tears. The time passed by unheeded. Patricius, her husband, was safe in God's hands. But Augustine, her eldest born, her darling, in what dark paths was he wandering? And yet in her heart of hearts there was a deep conviction that no sad news of his life at Carthage could shake. His was not the nature to find contentment in the things of earth. He was born to something higher. His noble heart, his strong intelligence, would bring him back to God. And yet, her heart sank as she thought of graces wasted, of conscience trampled underfoot, of light rejected. No, there was no hope anywhere but with God. In Him she would trust, and in Him alone. He was infinite in mercy and strong to save. He had promised that He would never fail those who put their trust in Him. At His feet, and at His feet alone, Monica poured out her tears and her sorrow. With others she was serene and hopeful as of old, even joyous, always ready to help and comfort. It was said of her after her death that no one had such a gift of helping others as she. She never preached at people. Most people have an insurmountable dislike to being preached at, but every word she said had a strange power of drawing souls to God, of making them wish to be better. Augustine, meanwhile, at Carthage, was justifying all the hopes that had been formed of him. He had even greater gifts, it seemed, than eloquence, feeling, and wit. He was at the head of his class in rhetoric. His master had spoken to him of a certain treatise of Aristotle which he would soon be called upon to study. It was so profound, he said, that few could understand it, even with the help of the most learned professors. Augustine, eager to make acquaintance with this wonderful work, procured it at once and read it. It seemed to him perfectly simple. It was unnecessary, he found, to ask a single explanation. It was the same with geometry, music, every science he took up. This young genius of 19 only discovered there were difficulties in the way when he had to teach others, and realized how hard it was to make them understand what was so exceedingly simple to himself. There was something strangely sympathetic and attractive about Augustine. He seemed modest and reserved about his own gifts, although he himself tells us in his Confessions that he was full of pride and ambition. He had a gift of making true and faithful friends, a charm in conversation that drew his young companions and even older men to his side. A more worldly mother than Monica would have been thoroughly proud of her son. Faith and virtue were alone weak and faint in that soul that could so ill do without them, but to her they were the one essential thing. The rest did not matter. Yet Monica, with true insight, believed that with noble minds knowledge must draw men to God. She hoped much, therefore, that Augustine's brilliance of intellect would save him in the end, and her hopes were not deceived. Already the noble philosophy of Cicero, pagan though he was, had awakened a thirst for wisdom in the young student's soul. Already he felt the emptiness of earthly joys. "I longed, my God," he writes, "to fly from the things of the earth to Thee, and I knew not that it was Thou that wast working in me." "One thing cooled my ardor," he goes on to say. "It was that the name of Christ was not there. And this name, by Thy mercy, Lord, of Thy Son, my Saviour, my heart had drawn in with my mother's milk, and kept in its depths. And every doctrine where this name did not appear, fluent, elegant, and truth-like though it might be, could not master me altogether." He then turned to the Holy Scriptures, but they appear to him inferior in style to Cicero. "My pride," he writes, "despised the manner in which the things are said, and my intelligence could not discover the hidden sense. They became great only for the humble, and I disdained to humble myself, and inflated with vainglory, I believed myself great." It was at this moment that he came in contact with the Manicheans, whose errors attracted him at once. This extraordinary heresy had begun in the East, and had spread all over the civilized world. Its followers formed a secret society, with signs and passwords, grades and initiations. To impose on Christians, they used Christian words for doctrines that were thoroughly unchristian. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about them was their hatred of the Church. Augustine, who remained amongst them for 9 years, thus describes them when writing to a friend: "Thou knowest, Honoratus, that for this reason alone did we fall into the hands of these men, namely, that they professed to free us from all errors, and bring us to God by pure reason alone, without that terrible principle of authority. For what else induced me to abandon the faith of my childhood, and follow these men for almost 9 years, but their assertion that we were terrified by superstition into a faith blindly imposed upon our reason, while they urged no one to believe until the truth was fully discussed and proved. Who would not be seduced by such promises, especially if he were a proud, contentious young man, thirsting for truth, such as they then found me?" That was what the Manicheans promised. What Augustine found amongst them he also tells us. "They incessantly repeated to me, 'Truth, truth,' but there was no truth in them. They taught what was false, not only about Thee, my God, who art the very truth, but even about the elements of this world, Thy creatures." So much for their doctrines. As for the teachers themselves, he found them carnal and loquacious, full of insane pride. The great charm of Manichaeism to Augustine was that it taught that a man was not responsible for his sins. This doctrine was convenient to one who could not find the strength to break with his bad habits. "Such was my mind," he sums up later, looking back on this period of his life, "so weighed down, so blinded by the flesh, that I was myself unknown to myself. End of chapter 6.
Chapter 7. How Saint Monica's heart was well nigh broken by the news that her son had abjured the Christian faith. Ill news travels fast. Augustine had scarcely joined the Manicheans before the tidings reached Monica. At first she could hardly believe it. This was a blow for which she had not been prepared. It crushed her to the earth. She would have grieved less over the news of her son's death. And yet she bent her broken heart to God's will, and hoped on in Him, whose mercy cannot fail. Augustine had announced the faith of his childhood publicly, she heard later. He had been entered by the Manicheans as an auditor, the first degree of initiation in their sect. And with all the zeal and ardour that he carried into everything he did, he was advocating this abominable heresy and persuading his companions to follow his example. Her eyes grew dim with weeping for her son. He was dead indeed to God, the God who was her all in all. The vacation was near, and Augustine would then return to Tagaste. Perhaps she would find that it was not so bad as she thought. It might have been only the whim of a moment. She would wait and see. Alas, the hope was in vain. Augustine had scarcely been home a day before he began obstinately to air his new opinions, determined that she should listen. Then the Christian in Monica rose above the mother. Her horror of heresy was for the moment stronger than her love for her son. Standing before him, outraged and indignant, she told him plainly that if he spoke in such a way she could no longer receive him at her table or in her house. Augustine was amazed. He had found out at last the limits of his mother's endurance. With bent head he left the house and sought the hospitality of Romanianus. No sooner had he gone than Monica's heart melted. The mother love surged up again. With bitter tears she cried on God to help her. Her grief seemed greater than she could bear. At last the night came, and with it peace. As she slept, exhausted with weeping, she had a dream which brought her a strange sense of hope and comfort. It seemed to her that she was standing on a narrow rule or plank of wood. Her heart weighed down with sorrow as it had been all through the day. Suddenly there came towards her a young man, radiant and fair of face. Smiling at her, he asked the cause of her tears. "I am weeping," she answered, "for the loss of my son." "Grieve no more, then," he replied, "for look, your son is standing there beside you." Monica turned her head. It was true. Augustine stood at her side on the plank of wood. "Be of good cheer," continued the stranger, "for where you are, there shall he be also." Then Monica awoke, the words ringing in her ears. It seemed to her that God had spoken. In the morning she went straight to Augustine and told him of her dream. "Perhaps," suggested her son, anxious to turn it to his own advantage, "it means that you will come to see things as I do." "No," said Monica firmly, "for he did not say, 'Where he is, you shall be,' but 'Where you are, there he shall be.'" Augustine was even more struck by the earnestness of his mother's answer than by the dream itself, though he pretended to make light of both. Not long after, Monica went to see a certain holy bishop, that she might beg him to use his influence with Augustine to bring him back to the truth. The wise old man listened attentively to her story. "Let him alone for the present, but pray much," was his advice, "for as yet he is obstinate and puffed up with these new ideas. If what you tell me of your son is true, he will read for himself and find out his error." Then, seeing the anguish of the poor mother, he told her that he himself in his youth had been led away by the Manicheans, and had even been employed in transcribing their works. It was that which had saved him, for as he wrote the truth became clear to him. He had seen how much their doctrines were to be avoided. Then, as Monica wept for disappointment, for she had counted greatly on his help, a sudden pity seized him. "Go thy ways, and God bless thee," he cried. "It is impossible that a son of such tears should perish." Monica's dream and the words of the bishop were like rays of light in the darkness. She drew fresh hope from them and redoubled her prayers. Vacation drew to an end, and Augustine returned to Carthage. But not for long. He was now 20 years old. His friend and patron, Romanianus, was very anxious that he should open a school in Tagaste while waiting for something better, and this he resolved to do. A little circle of pupils began to gather round him, who were later to follow the young master in all his wanderings. Among these was Alypius, an old schoolfellow and devoted friend of the sons of Romanianus, and another friend of Augustine's childhood whose name we do not know, but who was dearer to him than all the rest. They were of the same age, had studied together, had the same tastes and the same ambitions. Influenced by Augustine, still warm in the praise of the Manichaeans, he as well as the rest had abjured the Catholic faith to join their heresy. Augustine had been about a year at Tagaste when his friend was taken suddenly ill. He lay unconscious in a burning fever. There seemed to be no hope of recovery. He had been a catechumen before he had joined the Manichaeans. His parents, who were Christians, having begged that he might be baptized before he died, the life-giving waters were poured on him as he lay between life and death. Augustine made no protest, so sure was he that what he himself had taught him before he was taken ill would have more influence than a rite administered without his knowledge or consent. To every one's surprise the young man recovered his senses and began to mend. Augustine then laughingly told him what they had been doing, and went on to make fun of the whole proceeding, never doubting but that the sick man would enjoy the joke as much as he did. To his great surprise his friend turned from him in horror. "Never speak to me in such a way again if you wish to keep my affection," he said. "We will talk of this matter when you are stronger," thought Augustine. But a few days later the invalid had a relapse and died, with the white robe of his baptism still unstained. Augustine was inconsolable. Everything in Tagaste reminded him of the dear companion of his boyhood. "My own country became as a punishment to me," he writes, "and my father's house a misery, and all places or things in which I communicated with him were turned into a bitter torment to me, being now without him. My eyes sought him everywhere, and I hated all things because they had him not." The thought of death was full of horror to him, and he gave way to a deep depression. His health, never very robust, began to suffer. Romanianus, much as he wished to keep him at Tagaste, realized that a change of scene would be the best thing for him, and agreed to his proposal to return to Carthage and open a school of rhetoric. Alypius and his other disciples followed him, and in the rush of the great city Augustine regained, to some extent, his peace of mind. While teaching, he continued his own studies, and competed for public prizes. Many men of note joined his school, and his name began to be famous. He greatly desired honour, he tells us, but only if honourably won. One day a certain magician paid him a visit. He had heard, he said, that Augustine was about to compete for one of the state prizes in rhetoric. What would he be ready to give if he could ensure him the victory? It was only necessary to offer some living creatures in sacrifice to the demons whom he worshipped, and success would be certain. Augustine turned from him in horror and disgust. He had not yet fallen so low as this. "I would not sacrifice a fly," he retorted hotly, "to win a crown of gold." The magician retired in haste, and Augustine, who succeeded in carrying off the prize without the help of the demons, was publicly crowned by the proconsul Vindicius, who from thenceforth joined the circle of his friends. The news of his success reached Monica. Her mother's heart rejoiced in his triumph, but her joy was tempered with sorrow. Carthage had taken more from her son than it would ever give him, and her thoughts were of other victories and other crowns. During his stay in Tagaste, although Augustine had not lived under the same roof with his mother, he had been continually with her. Her tender affection had been his greatest comfort in the deep sorrow after his friend's death. He spoke no more to her of religion, and she, mindful of the old bishop's words, was also silent. "While I was struggling in the mire and in the darkness of error," writes Augustine, "that holy, chaste, devout, and sober widow, such as thou lovest, ceased not in all the hours of her prayers to bewail me in thy sight, and her prayers were admitted into thy presence, and yet thou sufferedst me to go on still and to be involved in that darkness. The darkness was indeed great, but the fires were still smouldering beneath the ashes. Love, honor, and success were all his, and yet he was not content. There was something in that soul that none of these things could satisfy. After thee, O Truth, he cries, I hungered and thirsted. His heart still ached for the loss of his friend. He turned everywhere for comfort and found none. He sought forgetfulness in study. He wrote 2 books, on the Beautiful and the Apt, and dedicated them to Hierus, a famous Roman orator. It seemed to me a great thing, he tells us, that my style and my studies should be known to such a man. Monica drew fresh hope from her son's writings. They were full of noble thoughts and high aspirations. Such a mind could not remain in error. Some day surely in God's good time he would come to know the truth. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8. How Augustine planned to go to Rome, and how he cruelly deceived his mother. It was about this time that Augustine's enthusiasm for the Manichaeans began to cool. He had been studying their doctrines, and had found that they were not quite what he thought. He was disappointed with their professors, too. The first unpleasant truth that dawned upon him was that they were much better at denying the doctrines of the Catholic Church than at explaining their own. It was almost impossible to find out what they believed, so vague do they become when closely questioned. And Augustine questioned very closely indeed. He was on the track of truth, and it was not easy to put him off with hazy general statements. He was still only an auditor, and before he took any further step he wanted to be certain of his ground. The men whom he consulted did not seem very certain of their own, he remarked, but they bade him to have patience. One of their bishops, Faustus by name, was soon coming to Carthage. He was one of their most brilliant preachers, and would soon be able to answer all Augustine's questions. This sounded promising, and Augustine awaited his coming impatiently. He certainly was an eloquent speaker. His sermons were charming. But when Augustine went to him privately, and explained his doubts to him, the result was not what he hoped for. He gave the same vague answers that Augustine had so often heard already. Pressed closer, he frankly replied that he had not learned enough to be able to satisfy him. Augustine was pleased with his honesty, and they became good friends. But the seeker was no nearer the truth than before. Yet if Faustus could not answer him, which of the Manichaeans could? He began to lose faith in them. What did the Catholic Church teach on these points, he asked. This was a question which they could all answer, and did, with great eagerness and little truth. It might have occurred to a less intelligent man than Augustine that the enemies of the Church were not the people to answer such a question fairly or truthfully. But he accepted their facts, and decided that truth was not to be found there either. Was there such a thing at all? Was the final question he asked himself. The old philosophers, heathens as they were, seemed to get nearer to the heart of things than this. Yet now and again, out of the very sickness of his soul, a prayer would break out to that Christ whom he had known and loved in his boyhood, but who had grown so dim to him since the Manichaeans had taught him that his sacred humanity was nothing but a shadow. He was weary of life, weary even of pleasure, weary of everything, weary most of all of Carthage. Owing to the wild ways of the students, it was impossible to keep anything like order in the schools. Classes were constantly interrupted by gangs of smashers, who might break in at any moment, setting the whole place in an uproar. Augustine's friends pressured him to go to Rome. There, they urged, he would meet with the honor that he deserved. There the students were quieter and better mannered. No rioting was allowed. The scholars might enter no school but that of their own master. This sounded hopeful. Augustine was rather pleased with the idea. He wrote to Monica and to his patron Romanianus to tell them of the step he proposed to take. Monica's heart sank when she read the letter. To the Christians of the fourth century, Rome was another Babylon. She had poured out the blood of the saints like water. She was the home of every abomination. What would become of Augustine in Rome? Without faith, without ideals, a disabled ship, drifting with every wind? He must not go, she decided, and if he did she would go with him. She prayed that she might be able to make him give up the project, and wrote strongly against it, but Augustine had already made up his mind. Then in despair she set out for Carthage, to make one last effort. Her son was touched by her grief and by her entreaties, but his plans were made. He was to start that very night. "I lied to my mother," he says, "and such a mother!" He assured her that he was not going, that she might set her mind at rest. A friend of his was leaving Carthage, and he had promised to go down to the harbour to see him off. Some instinct warned Monica that he was deceiving her. "I will go with you," she said. This was very awkward for her son. He was at his wits' end to know what to do. They went down to the harbour together, where they found Augustine's friend. No ship could put out that night, the sailors said. The wind was dead against them. The young men were unwilling to leave the harbour in case the wind should change and they should miss the boat, while Monica was determined not to leave Augustine. They walked up and down together on the seashore in the cool evening air. The hours passed. The situation became more and more difficult for Augustine. What was he to do? Monica was weary and worn out with grief. An idea suggested itself to him suddenly. It was no use waiting any longer, he said. It would be better to take some rest. The boats would certainly not start that night. Monica was in no mood to rest, but Augustine knew her love of prayer. There was a little chapel on the seashore dedicated to St. Cyprian. Would she not at least go there and take shelter until the morning? He promised her again that he would not leave Carthage, and she at last consented, for her soul was full of sorrow. Kneeling there in the stillness of the little chapel, she poured out the troubles of her heart to God, beseeching him that he would not let Augustine leave her. The answer seemed a strange one. As she prayed, the wind suddenly changed. The sailors prepared to depart. Augustine and his friend went on board, and the ship set sail for Rome. The last thing they saw as the shore faded away in the dim gray morning was the little chapel of St. Cyprian, lying like a speck in the distance. But they did not see a lowly figure that stood on the sand and stretched out piteous hands to heaven, wailing for the son whom she had lost a second time. It was God alone who knew all the bitterness of that mother's heart. It was God alone who knew how, after the first uncontrollable outburst of grief, she bent herself in faith and love to endure the heartbreak, silent and uncomplaining. It was only God who knew that the parting that seemed so cruel was to lead to the granting of her lifelong prayer, to be the first stage in her son's conversion. "She turned herself to thee to pray for me," says Augustine, "and went about her accustomed affairs, and I arrived at Rome." It seemed indeed as if his arrival in Rome was destined to be the end of his earthly career, for soon afterwards he was attacked by a violent fever and lay at death's door. He was lodging in the house of a Manichaean, for, although he no longer held with their doctrines, he had many friends among them in Carthage, who had recommended him to some of their sect in Rome. Augustine himself was convinced that he owed his life at this time to his mother's prayers. God would not, for her sake, let him be cut off thus in all his sins, unbaptized and unrepentant, lest that mother's heart should be broken and her prayers unanswered. He recovered and began to teach. Already, while he was in Carthage, he had suspected that the lives of the Manichaeans were not much better than those of the heathens among whom they lived, although they gave out that their creed was the only one likely to reform human nature. In Rome his suspicions were confirmed. Thinking that Augustine was altogether one of themselves, they threw off the mask and showed themselves in their true colours. The pagans at least were honest. They professed openly that they lived for nothing but enjoyment, and in this great city, even more than in Carthage, one could learn how low a man could fall. But at least they were not hypocrites. He resolved to cut himself adrift from the Manichaeans altogether. There was a Christian Rome within the pagan Rome, But of this Augustine knew nothing. On the throne of the fishermen sat St. Damasus, wise and holy. His secretary, St. Jerome, was already famous, no less for his eloquence than for the greatness of his character. Jerome, like Augustine, had been carried away in his youth by the downward tide, but had retrieved himself by a glorious penance. The descendants of the oldest Roman families were to be found in the hospitals, tending the sick, or working among the poor in the great city. The first monasteries were growing up, little centres of faith and prayer in the desert. They were peopled by men and women who had counted the world well lost for Christ, or by those who to save their souls had fled, as the great St. Benedict was to do later, from the corruptions that had dragged down so many to the abyss. Augustine had been greatly attracted shortly before leaving Carthage by the preaching of Helpidius, a Catholic priest. The idea came to him while in Rome to go to the Catholics and find out what they really taught, but he dismissed it. The Manichaeans had already told him, he reflected, that no intelligent man would accept their doctrines. Besides, they were too strict, their ideals were too high, he would have to give up too much. One more honest impulse was stifled. He entered a school of philosophers who professed to believe in nothing. It was, he decided, the wisest philosophy he knew. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9. How Augustine came to Milan, and how his tempest-tossed soul found light and peace at last. Augustine had not been a year in Rome before he discovered that the ways of the Roman students were not quite so delightful as he had been led to believe. They were less insolent, that is true, than those of Carthage, and not so rough, but they had other defects which were quite as trying. They would, for instance, attend the classes of a certain professor until the time arrived to pay their fees, when, deserting in a body to another school, they would proceed to play the same trick there. It was certainly one way of getting an education for nothing, but it was hard on the teachers. It seemed scarcely the profession in which one could likely make a fortune, even if it were possible to earn one's daily bread. Augustine was discouraged and sick at heart. Everything seemed to be against him. There was no hope, no light anywhere. His life seemed doomed to be a failure, in spite of all his gifts. Then, quite suddenly, came the opening that he had longed for. Symmachus, the prefect of Rome, received a letter from Milan, requesting him to name a professor of rhetoric for the vacant chair in the city. A competition was announced in which Symmachus himself, a well-known orator, was to be judge. Augustine entered and won the prize. It was an excellent and honorable position. The professor was supported by the state. The Emperor Valentinian held his court in the city, which gave it a certain position. Augustine was furnished with letters of introduction to Ambrose the bishop, who had been brilliantly successful at the bar in his youth, and was probably an old friend of Symmachus. He was of a noble Roman family, and famous alike for his great learning and peculiar charm of manner. He was famous also for his holiness of life, but this was of less interest to Augustine. It was Ambrose the orator with whom he desired to make acquaintance. No sooner had he arrived in Milan than he presented himself before the bishop, who received him with a cordial courtesy that attracted Augustine at once. The only way to judge of his eloquence was to attend the sermons at the cathedral. This Augustine began to do regularly. He found that Ambrose had not been overpraised. He listened to him at first with the pleasure it always gave him to hear an eloquent speaker. Then gradually, with a shock of surprise, he began to attend to what the bishop said, as well as to his manner of saying it. Ambrose was explaining the doctrines of the Church. He spoke very clearly and simply, to the intelligence no less than to the heart, for there were many catechumens in his congregation, as well as pagans who were listening for the truth. The Manichaeans had deceived him then, thought Augustine. They had lied about the Church's teaching, or they themselves had been ignorant of it, and he had let himself be deceived. This was altogether unlike what they had told him. It was noble and sublime. All that was great and good in him responded. Had he found the truth at last? In the meantime Monica, determined to rejoin her son, arrived in Milan. The journey had been long and dangerous. They had been assailed by terrible storms. Even the sailors had lost courage. It was she who had comforted them in their fear. "The storm will soon be over," she assured them. "I know that we shall reach our journey's end in safety." She had a strong conviction that she would not die until her prayers had won Augustine back to God. The sailors took heart again at her words. Her calm eyes strengthened them. They felt that this gentle woman knew things that were hidden from them. Monica's first visit was to St. Ambrose. The two noble natures understood each other at once. "Thank God for having given you such a mother," said the bishop to Augustine, when he met him a few days later. "She is one in 1,000." Much had happened since mother and son had parted, and much had to be told. The first thing that Monica heard was that Augustine had left the Manichaeans. At this she rejoiced greatly. She was convinced, she told him, that she would see him a Catholic before she died. "Thus she spoke to me," says Augustine, "but to thee, O fountain of mercy, she redoubled her prayers and her tears, beseeching thee to hasten thine aid and dispel my darkness." They went together now to the sermons, and sat side by side in the church as in the days of Augustine's childhood. One by one he laid aside the false ideas of the truth that had been given to him by the Manichaeans. It was growing clearer to him every day. True, there was much that was above his understanding, above the understanding of any human being, as Ambrose frankly acknowledged, but not above their faith. The Manichaeans had sneered at faith as childish and credulous, and yet, thought Augustine, how many things he believed that he could have no possibility of proving. He believed, for instance, that Hannibal had crossed the Alps, although he had not been present at the time. He believed that Athens existed, although he had never been there. As of old, a little group of friends had gathered round him at Milan. There was Alypius, the most beloved of his associates, who had taken the place of the dear dead friend of his boyhood. There was Romanianus, who was there on state business, and Licentius, his son, with Trijachus, both pupils of Augustine's, Nebridius, who had been with him in Carthage, and was, like himself, a native of Roman Africa, and several new friends he had made in Milan. It was agreed amongst them that they should set apart a certain time each day to seek for the truth, reading and discussing among themselves. The Scriptures were to form part of the reading. "Great hope has dawned," wrote Augustine. "The Catholic faith teaches not what we thought and vainly accused it of. Life is vain, death uncertain. If it steals upon us of a sudden, in what state shall we depart hence? And where shall we learn what here we have neglected? Let us not delay to seek after God and the blessed life." There was in Milan a holy priest called Simplicianus, greatly beloved by St. Ambrose, for he had been his teacher and guide in early life. To him Augustine resolved to go. He might be able to help him. He told Simplicianus, amongst other things, that he had been reading a book of philosophy translated by a Roman called Victorinus. The book was good, said Simplicianus, but the story of Victorinus' own life was better. He had known him well in Rome. Augustine was interested. He would like to hear the story, he said. "Victorinus," said the old man, "was a pagan and a worshipper of the heathen gods. He was a famous orator, and taught rhetoric to some of the noblest citizens of Rome. He was learned in every science, and was so celebrated for his virtue that a statue had been erected to him in the Forum. In his old age, after earnest study, he became a Christian, but remained a long time a catechumen through fears of what his friends would say. At last, taking courage, he prepared himself for baptism, and to punish himself for his human respect, insisted on reading his profession of faith aloud before the whole congregation, instead of making it, as was usual, in private. This courageous action of an old man made Augustine feel his own cowardice. He believed now that the Catholic Church was the true Church, and yet he could not face the thought of baptism. He would have to give up so much. The Christian standard was high for a man who spent his life in self-indulgence. He could never attain to it. He took leave of Simplicianus sadly. The help which he needed was not to be found there. "I went about my usual business," he says, "while my anxiety increased as I daily sighed to thee." He frequented the church now even when there were no sermons, for he began to feel the need of prayer. One day when Alypius and he were alone together, there came in a friend of theirs, Pontitianus, a devout Christian, who held a post at the emperor's court. Finding the epistles of St. Paul upon the table, he smiled at Augustine, saying that he was glad that he was reading from them, for they were full of teaching. He began to tell them about St. Anthony, and of the many hermitages and monasteries in Egypt, and even here in his own country. He spoke to them of the monastic life and its virtues, and seeing their interest and astonishment, went on to tell them an incident that had happened a short time before. Two young men of the imperial court, friends of his own, walking together in the country, came to a cottage inhabited by some holy recluses. A life of St. Anthony lay on the table. One of them took it up and began to read. His first feeling was one of astonishment, his second of admiration. "How uncertain life is," he said suddenly to his companion. "We are in the emperor's service. I wish we were God's. I would rather be his friend than the emperor's." He read on with sighs and groans. At last he shut the book and arose. "My mind is made up," he said. "I shall enter God's service here and now. If you will not do so too, at least do not try to hinder me." "You have chosen well," said the other. "I am with you in this." They never left the hermitage. This story only increased Augustine's misery. He had had more graces than these young men, and had wasted them. He was a coward. When Pontitianus had gone away, he left Alypius and went out to the garden. Alypius followed and sat down beside him. "What are we about?" cried Augustine hotly. "The unlearned take heaven by force, and we, with all our heartless learning, wallow in the mire." He sank his face in his hands and groaned. The way lay clear before him. He had found the eternal truth, for which he had been seeking so long, and he had not the courage to go further. This and that he would have to do. This and that he would have to give up. He could not. It was too hard. And yet to stand with both feet on the rock of truth, was it not worth all this and more? So the battle raged. Good and evil struggled together in his soul. It seemed to him then that he saw a long procession winding across the garden. It passed him and faded in the distance. First came boys and girls, young and weak, scarcely more than children. They had mocked him gently. "We have fought and conquered," they said, "even we." And after them came a great multitude of men and women in the prime of life, some strong and vigorous, some feeble and sickly. It seemed to Augustine that they looked at him with eyes full of contempt. "We have lived purely," they said. "We have striven and conquered." They were followed by old men and women, worn with age and suffering. They looked at him reproachfully. "We have fought and conquered. We have endured to the end." Augustine's self-control was leaving him. Even Alypius' presence was more than he could bear. He leapt to his feet, went to the other end of the garden, and throwing himself down on the ground, wept as if his heart would break. His soul, tossed this way and that in its anguish, cried desperately to God for help. Suddenly, on the stillness of the summer afternoon, there broke the sound of a child's voice, sweet, insistent. "Tolle lege," it sang. "Tolle lege. Take and read." Augustine stood up. There was no one there, no human being was in sight. "Tolle lege, tolle lege," rang the sweet voice again and again in his ear, now on this side, now on that. Was this the answer to his prayer? He remembered how St. Anthony had opened the sacred scriptures on a like occasion, and found the help that he required. Going back to Alypius, he took the sacred volume and opened it up. "Put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh and the concupiscence thereof," he read. Light, strength, conviction flowed into his soul. With God's help all things were possible. He would give up all and follow him. Then, having carefully marked the place, he sat down beside Alypius and told him of his resolution. "What about me?" asked Alypius. "Perhaps there is something there for me too. Let me see." He took the book from Augustine, opened it at the place he had marked, and read, "He that is weak in the faith, take unto you." "That will do very well for me," he said. Augustine's first thought was for Monica. He must go to her, and at once. They sat together hand in hand until the sun sank in a rose-colored glory, and the cool shadows of the evening fell like a blessing on the earth. There are some joys too deep for speech, too holy to be touched by mortal hands. End of chapter 9.
Chapter 10. How Saint Monica lived at Cassiacum with Augustine and his friends, and how Augustine was baptized by Saint Ambrose. Amongst the saints there are two great penitents, Saint Mary Magdalene and Saint Augustine, who in the first moment of their conversion shook themselves wholly free from the trammels of the past and never looked back again. "Thou hast broken my bonds in sunder," cries St. Augustine. "To thee will I offer the sacrifice of praise." Honors, wealth, pleasure, all things he had desired so passionately, were now as nothing to him. "For thou didst expel them from me," he says, "and didst come in thyself instead of them. And I sang to thee, my Lord God, my true honor, my riches, and my salvation." The vacation was close at hand. Augustine resolved to give up his professorship and to go away quietly to prepare himself for baptism. Verecundus, one of the little group of faithful friends who surrounded him, had a country house in Cassiacum, which he offered for his use while he remained in Italy. It was a happy party that gathered within its walls. There were Augustine and his younger brother Navigius, the faithful Alpius, who was to receive baptism with his friend, Licentius and Trigetius, Augustine's two pupils, and several others. Lastly, there was Monica, who was a mother to them all, and whose sunny presence did much to enliven the household. It was autumn, an Italian mid-September. The country was a glory of green and gold and crimson, the Apennines lying like purple shadows in the distance. Here, in the seclusion that was so dear to his heart, Augustine read the Psalms for the first time. His soul was on fire with their beauty. Every word carried him to God. Monica read with him, and he tells us that he would often turn to her for an explanation. "For," he continues, "she was walking steadily in the path in which I was as yet feeling my way." There were other studies besides to be carried on, and St. Augustine tells us of some of the interesting discussions that were held on the lawn or in the hall of the baths, which they used when the weather was not fine enough to go out. One morning, when he and his pupils were talking of the wonderful harmony and order that exist in nature, the door opened and Monica looked in. "How are you getting on?" she asked, for she knew what they were discussing. Augustine invited her to join them, but Monica smiled. "I have never heard of a woman amongst the philosophers," she said. "That is a mistake," replied Augustine. "There were women philosophers amongst the ancients, and you know, my dear mother, that I like your philosophy very much. Philosophy means nothing else but love of wisdom. Now you love wisdom more even than you love me, and I know how much that is. Why, you are so far advanced in wisdom that you fear no ill fortune, not even death itself. Everybody says that this is the very height of philosophy. I will therefore sit at your feet as your disciple." Monica, still smiling, told her son that he had never told so many lies in his life. In spite of her protests, however, they would not let her go, and she was enrolled amongst the philosophers. The discussions, says St. Augustine, owe a good deal of their beauty to her presence. The 15th of November was Augustine's birthday. After dinner he invited his friends to come to the hall of the baths, that their souls might be fed also. "For I suppose you all admit," he said, when they had settled themselves for conversation, "that we are made up of soul and body." To this everybody agreed but Navigius, who was inclined to argue, and who said he did not know. "Do you mean," asked Augustine, "that there is nothing at all that you do know? Or that of the few things you do not know, this is one?" Navigius was a little put out at this question, but they pacified him, and at last persuaded him to say that he was as certain of the fact that he was made up of body and soul as anybody could be. Then they agreed that food was taken for the sake of the body. "Must not the soul have its food too?" asked Augustine. "And what is that food? Is it not knowledge?" Monica agreed to this, but Trigetius objected. "Why, you yourself," said Monica, "are a living proof of it. Did you not tell us at dinner that you did not know what you were eating because you were lost in thought? Yet your teeth were working all the time. Where was your soul at that moment, if not feeding too?" Then Augustine, reminding them that it was his birthday, said that as he had already given them a little feast for the body, he would now give them one for the soul. Were they hungry, he asked. There was an eager chorus of assent. "Can a man be happy," he said, "if he has not what he wants? And is he happy if he has it?" Monica was the first to answer this question. "If he wants what is good and has it," she replied, "he is happy. But if he wants what is bad, he is not happy, even if he has it." "Well said, mother," cried Augustine. "You have reached the heights of philosophy at a single bound." Someone then said that if a man were needy, he could not be happy. Finally, they all agreed that only he who possessed God could be wholly happy. But the discussion had gone on for a long time, and Augustine suggested that the soul might have too much nourishment as well as the body, and that it would be better to put off the rest until tomorrow. The discussion was continued next day. "Since only he who possesses God can be happy, who is he who possesses God?" asked Augustine, and they were all invited to give their opinion. "He that leads a good life," answered one. "He who does God's will," said another. "He who is pure of heart," said a third. Navigius would not say anything, but agreed with the last speaker. Monica approved of them all. St. Augustine continued, "Is it God's will that all should seek him?" "Of course," they all replied. "Can he who seeks God be leading a bad life?" "Certainly not," they said. "Can a man who is not pure in heart seek God?" "No," they agreed. "Then," said Augustine, "what have we here? A man who leads a good life, does God's will, and is pure of heart, is seeking God, but he does not yet possess him. Therefore we cannot uphold that they who lead good lives, do God's will, and are pure of heart, possess God." They all laughed at the trap in which he had caught them, but Monica, saying that she was slow to grasp these things, asked to have the argument repeated. Then she thought a moment. "No one can possess God without seeking him," she said. "True," said Augustine, "but while he is seeking, he does not yet possess." "I think there is no one who does not have God," she says, "but those who live well have him for their friend, and those who live badly make themselves his enemies." Let us change the statement, "He who possesses God is happy," to "He who has God for his friend is happy." All agreed to this but Navigius. "No," he said, "for this reason. If he is happy who has God for his friend, and God is the friend of those who seek him, and those who seek him do not possess him, for to this all have agreed, then it is obvious that those who are seeking God have not what they want. And we all agreed yesterday that a man cannot be happy unless he has what he wants." Monica could not see her way out of this difficulty, although she was sure there was one. "I yield," she said, "for logic is against me." "Well," said Augustine, "we have reached the conclusion that he who has found God has him for his friend and is happy. But he who is still seeking God has him for his friend, but is not yet happy. He, however, who has separated himself from God by sin, has neither God for his friend, nor is he happy." This satisfied everybody. The other side of the question was then considered. "In what did unhappiness consist?" asked Augustine. Monica maintained that neediness and unhappiness must go together. For he who has not what he wants is both needy and unhappy. Augustine then supposed a man who had everything he wanted in this world. Could it be said that he was needy? Yet, was it certain that he was happy? Licentius suggested that there would remain with him the fear of losing what he had. "That fear," replied Augustine, "would make him unhappy, but would not make him needy. Therefore we could have a man who is unhappy without being needy." To this everyone agreed but Monica, who still argued that unhappiness could not be separated from neediness. "This supposed man of yours," she said, "rich and fortunate, still fears to lose his good fortune. That shows that he wants wisdom. Can we call a man who wants money needy, and not call him so when he wants wisdom?" At this remark there was a general outcry of admiration. It was the very argument, said Augustine, that he had meant to use himself. "Nothing," said Licentius, "could have been more truly and divinely said. What indeed is more wretched than to lack wisdom? And the wise man can never be needy, whatever else he lacks." Augustine then went on to define wisdom. "The wisdom that makes us happy," he said, "is the wisdom of God, and the wisdom of God is the Son of God. Perfect life is the only happy life," he continued, "and to this, by means of firm faith, cheerful hope, and burning love, we shall surely be brought if we but hasten towards it." So the discussion ended, and all were content. "Oh," cried Trigetius, "how I wish you would provide us with a feast like this every day." "Moderation in all things," answered Augustine. "If this has been a pleasure to you, it is God alone that you must thank." So the happy innocent days flew past in the pursuit of that wisdom which is eternal. "Too late I have loved thee, O beauty ever ancient, ever new," cried Augustine. "Behold, thou wast within me, and I was abroad, and there I sought thee. I have tasted thee, and I am hungry after thee. Thou hast touched me, and I am all on fire." At the beginning of Lent, Augustine and Alpius returned to Milan to attend the course of instructions which St. Ambrose was to give to those who were preparing for baptism. In the night between Holy Saturday and Easter Sunday, the stains of the past were washed away forever in those cleansing waters, and at the Mass of the daybreak on that blessed morning, Augustine knelt at the altar to receive his Lord. Monica was beside him. Her tears and her prayers had been answered. She and her son were one again in heart and soul. End of chapter 10.
Chapter 11. How St. Monica set out for Africa with St. Augustine, and how she died at Ostia on the Tiber. In the old days at Milan, before his conversion, Augustine had often told his friends that the dream of his life was to live quietly somewhere with a few friends, who would devote themselves to the search for truth. It had even been proposed to try this scheme, but it would not work. Some of his friends were married, others had worldly ties that they could not break. The idea had to be given up. Now that he found the truth, and at Cassiacum his dream had been, in a manner, realized. Why should they not continue to live like that, he asked Alypius, at all events until they were ready for work to which God had called them? And where should they live this life but in their own country, which was to be the future field of their labors? Alypius asked nothing better. Their friend Evodius, like themselves a citizen of Tagaste, who had been baptized a short time before, was ready to join them. He held a high position in the court of the emperor, but it seemed to him a nobler thing to serve the King of Kings. So these 3 future bishops of the Church in Africa made their plans together. Monica would be the mother of the little household, as she had been at Cassiacum. She was ready to go wherever they wished. A few days before they started, an event occurred that they all remembered later. It was the feast of St. Caprician, and Monica had returned from Mass absorbed in God, as she always was after Holy Communion. Perhaps she had been thinking of her night of anguish in the little chapel by the seashore at Carthage 3 years earlier, when God seemed deaf to her prayers in order that he might grant her the fullness of her heart's desire. Suddenly she turned to them with shining eyes. "Let us hasten to heaven," she cried. They gently questioned her as to what she meant, but she did not seem to hear them. "My soul and my flesh have rejoiced in the living God," she said, and they marveled at the heavenly beauty of her face. It was a long journey from Milan to Ostia on the Tiber, where they were to set sail for Africa. They remained there for some weeks, for the ship was not to start at once. One evening, Augustine and Monica were sitting together at a window that overlooked the garden and the ocean. They were talking of heaven, St. Augustine tells us, asking each other what that eternal life of the saints must be which eye hath not seen nor ear heard. How small in comparison were the things of the earth, they said, even the most beautiful of God's creations. For all these things were less than he who made them. As their 2 souls stretched out together towards the infinite love and wisdom, it seemed to them that for one moment, with the beat of one heart, they touched it, and the joy of that moment was a foreshadowing of eternity. They sighed as it faded from them, and they were forced to return again to the things of the earth. "Son," said Monica, "there is nothing in this world now that gives me any delight. What have I to do here any longer? I know not, for all I desired is granted. There is only one thing for which I wished to live, and that was to see you a Christian and a Catholic before I died. And now God has given me even more than I asked, for he has made you one of his servants, and you now desire no earthly happiness. What am I doing here?" About 5 days afterwards she fell ill of a fever. They thought she was tired with the long journey, and would soon be better, but she grew worse, and soon unconscious. When she opened her eyes, Augustine and Navigius were watching by her bed. "You will bury your mother here," she said. Augustine could not trust himself to speak, but Navigius, who knew how great had been her desire to be buried at Tagaste beside her husband, protested. "Oh, why are we not at home," he cried, "where you would wish to be?" Monica looked at him reproachfully. "Do you hear what he says?" she asked Augustine. "Lay my body anywhere," she said. "It does not matter. Let not that disturb you. This only I ask, that you remember me at God's altar wherever you may be. One is never far from God, she answered to another person who asked if it would not be a sorrow to her to be buried in a land so far from home. It was not only her sons who grieved, but the faithful friends who were with them. For was she not their mother too? Had she not taken as much care of them as if they had been her children? Augustine barely left her side, and she was glad to have him with her. As she thanked him one day for some little thing he had done for her, his lip quivered. She thought he was thinking of all the suffering he had caused her, and smiled at him with tender eyes. "You have always been a good son to me," she said. "Never have I heard a harsh or reproachful word from your lips." "My life was torn in two," says Augustine, "that life which was made up of mine and hers." They were all with her when she passed peacefully a few days later. They choked back their tears. "It did not seem meet," says Augustine, "to celebrate that death with groans and lamentations. Such things were fit for a less blessed deathbed, but not hers." Then, as they knelt gazing at the beloved face that seemed to be smiling at some unseen mystery, Evodius had a happy inspiration. Taking up the Psalter, he opened it at the 110th Psalm. "I will praise thee, O Lord, with my whole heart," he sang softly, "in the assembly of the just and in the congregation." "Great are the works of the Lord," sang the others, with trembling voices, "sought out as they are according unto all his pleasure." Friends and religious women who had gathered near the house to pray entered and joined in the chant. It was the voice of rejoicing rather than the cry of grief that followed that pure soul on its way to heaven. Augustine alone was silent, for his heart was breaking. We are but human, after all, and the sense of their loss fell upon them all later. That night Augustine lay thinking of his mother's life, and of the unselfish love of which it had been so full. "Thy handmaid, so pious towards thee, so careful and tender towards us. And I let go my tears," he tells us, "and let them flow as much as they could. I wept for her, who for so many years had wept for me." They buried her, as she herself had foretold, in Ostia, where her sacred relics were found 1,000 years later by Pope Martin V, and carried to the church of St. Augustine in Rome. The memory of the mother to whom he owed so much remained with Augustine until the day of his death. He loved to speak of her. 30 years later, while preaching to his people at Hippo, he said, "The dead do not come back to us. If it were so, how often should I see my Holy Mother at my side? She followed me over sea and land into far countries, that she might not lose me forever. God forbid that she would be less loving now that she is more blessed. Ah, no! She would come to help and comfort me, for she loved me more than I can tell. The dead do not come back. But who that has followed the career of the great bishop and doctor of the church can doubt that she prayed for him so fervently on earth has ceased to pray for him in heaven?" End of chapter 11.